She trusted him enough to fall asleep in his arms, and that trust, she would learn, had rounded edges that could coil like a noose. The ride home was too quiet for a city that never seemed to stop. Rain stitched thin silver lines across the windshield. The radio murmured an old song she could almost hum. Julia watched Doha's profile, the way his jaw caught the light from the street lamps, the effortless way his hand found the knob. He drove with a calm that felt designed for her, as if every slow shift of his shoulders had been rehearsed to steady her. It did. That night, it did. In the rearview mirror, she caught him smiling. It was the kind of smile that made her undo a knot of old defenses, the smile that had pulled her out of apartments that smelled of stale coffee and loneliness. It touched his lips first, but it never reached his eyes, and she could not say why she didn't notice that. She kept looking at him because he made her feel like she could stop looking at everything else. He had surprised her with the house a week later. A present, he said, with the casual authority of someone who had always known what was right for people. For a while, the house felt like a miracle she had not earned. High ceilings that swallowed her smallness, a kitchen that reflected her face a little too large in the oven glass, lights that woke up at a voice. Friends texted congratulations. Her mother clucked warnings thinly disguised as concern. But inside, between the rooms, Julia nested like an insect newly hatched inside an impossible shell. He had surprised her with the house a week later. A present, he said, with the casual authority of someone who had always known what was right for people. For a while, the house felt like a miracle she had not earned. High ceilings that swallowed her smallness. A kitchen that reflected her face a little too large in the oven glass. Lights that woke up at a voice. Friends texted congratulations. Her mother clucked warnings thinly disguised as concern. But inside, between the rooms, Julia nested like an insect newly hatched inside an impossible shell. A part of her, a tall, practical part, catalogued things silently even as she surrendered. How he left at strange hours and returned with the composure of someone who owned silence. How his sleep was so even it seemed practiced. How sometimes, when he laughed, there was a lag, as if the sound belonged to someone watching him from behind glass. Those were tiny frets at the edge of the fabric of normal. She closed her eyes when he tucked his hand along her spine. It was easier to pretend the fraying threads weren't there. If you've ever felt something was off with someone you trusted, tell us in the comments. The house became the center of a small orbit where Julia's gratitude and unease pulled in equal measure. She learned the pattern of the place. A corridor that whispered at night. Curtains that always seemed to fall differently in the morning. A mirror in the upstairs hallway that caught light wrong. The mirror was the worst. She kept thinking she saw two reflections for a beat, like an echo. Once, she watched the glass and thought she saw something move just at the corner of the frame. A darker ripple where a shoulder should be smooth. When she blinked, there was only her own face and the slant of the house behind her. Her mother called more than usual. "You don't know him," she would say. "Don't let a present buy your life." Julia would listen, and then when the call ended, the house felt emptier for the warning. It occurred to her that the things mothers say are sometimes not alarms but gaps, an expressed fear that cannot find solid form. Julia wanted to be better than worry. She wanted to be someone who could trust without reservation. That's what made the things she noticed feel like betrayals of her own judgment. Kem was different. Kem didn't say be careful in the way her mother did. She made lists of questions that felt practical and salvageable. "Does he have family here? Where did he get the money?" she asked over coffee, tearing at a sugar packet because sudden agitation needed small motions. Kem was blunt in a way that hurt and helped at the same time. "You're not wrong to check," she said once, eyes narrow in the middle distance. "You're only wrong if you don't do it carefully." For a while, Julia did nothing but watch. She watched the grooves at the corners of Doha's mouth, the way he folded his newspapers with surgical attention, how he always insisted on driving, how his phone frequently vibrated and then stayed quiet. Once, she followed him out of the house at dusk, keeping to the shadow of hedges like a child learning to play spy. He walked to his car with the measured stride of a man who rents his gestures to other people. He drove away down a road that led out of the neighborhood, leaving the street lamps to blink at his absence. Julia waited until a headlight swallowed the distance, then turned back to the house with her heart making a sound like a small animal trapped between ribs. She had seen nothing. The night had simply slid him away. That failure chipped at her confidence. Kem suggested recording, but talking about cameras felt like transforming the house into a stage. The thought of catching him asleep and finding out what he really was felt, in its way, like a moral test. Was she a person who could trust her own senses, or would she live the rest of her life explaining a suspicion she couldn't prove? There was also a knot of fear. If she went looking and found something monstrous, could she live with that knowledge? She paced around these questions, until the only plan that felt plausible was the smallest and most intimate. Stay awake through a night when he would surely sleep and watch him. No devices, no theatrics. Just her and him and the truth revealed by patience. She rehearsed how to keep him talkative until he might be tired, how to let drinks loosen the edges of his composure without crossing lines she could not return from. It felt cowardly and brave at once, and she oscillated between both. Kem stood by the doorway of her life like a lighthouse. "Be careful," Kem said again. But now there was a glint on her face that said she wouldn't judge if Julia did what she needed. The night she chose to watch was ordinary in the way that tragedies often begin. He made dinner as if making food for someone meant anchoring them to truths. He spoke about trivialities, architecture, a book he had read once, a rumor about a lost gallery opening. And the small things settled into the air like dust motes. She kept her lids heavy on purpose, leaning against him in a way that might encourage sleep, listening to the soft, almost imperceptible rhythm of his breath. He smelled like cedar and something else, a cool mineral scent she couldn't name. She told him stories of her childhood. He encouraged her to continue with a smile that kept its distance. Later, when she felt certain he had slipped into that even breathing, something in the air changed. It started as a minor difference. The damp puff of breath against her neck felt colder than it should. The hand at her waist, which had been warm minutes before, was suddenly a little cooler, like marble left on a sill. She told herself this was imagination. The house made odd temperatures. He was asleep, that was all. Then she felt the weight move. It did not shift like a man shifting. It unfurled. In the half-light of the living room, the sensation was a slow, deliberate slide, as if something long and heavy, wrapped in its own patience, was extending beneath the couch. She pulled back, breath snagging. Her eyes fixed on the space between his hip and the cushion. Something there made a sound that was not breath but a soft, dry whisper, like the undersides of leaves brushing against each other. Her mind, so practiced at smoothing over anomalies, refused to name the motion. She reached toward his shoulder, the small motion of someone wishing to confirm the normal. Her fingertips met skin that first felt ordinary, and then, in a terrible revelation, was not. There was a seam where flesh ended and a texture began, the suggestion of scale, a coolness, a slick sheen that reflected the lamp's light in patterns that her mind refused to reconcile with a human. It was not the overt slide of a snake in a desert. It moved with a deliberate grace, a geometry of muscle and patience, curling around itself under the couch. Her first thought was denial. Her second was a primitive animal alarm that slammed through her chest, quick and fierce. She tried to make a sound, but it was small and caught in the place where fear thickened words. Doha's face remained peaceful, eyes closed, breathing regular. The man she had fallen asleep in the arms of looked, for all the world, like a sleeping man. The thing under the couch was not asleep. She imagined the room filling with witnesses, imagined anyone stepping into the frame and corroborating the impossible. The idea dissolved into silence. Whatever was coiling there chose not to announce itself. It preferred to be seen by one person alone. Julia measured the distance from the couch to the front door, with the mathematics of an animal plotting escape. She could not step too quickly. Movement might wake him. She could not scream. The sound might dissolve the fragile patchwork of courage she needed to flee. She backed away, each centimeter feeling like a negotiation with a living trap. Her heart flapped against her ribs. The scales moved again, a slow, precise ripple that caught the light like an old coin. She did not want to wake him. She wanted him revealed and kept asleep. She wanted proof in the rawest sense. That was the logic of someone who had been betrayed by the ordinary and needed a ledger entry to prove it. She reached for her phone with trembling hands, and felt then, with a clarity she would later resent, that whatever was under the couch did not want to be recorded. The phone's screen populated with light, and then went blank, as if the house itself had swallowed its signal. She tried again. The screen remained obstinately dark, the camera refusing the one small duty it had to the truth. Panic is a theater in which all the props fail. Her hands found the lamp and turned it higher, blaming light for a miracle. The increased glare revealed more and made the world smaller. The scales were patterned in colors that resembled nothing exactly. An oil-sheen iridescence, a banded shadow that suggested brown and green and black without settling on any one name. It was wrong in every dictionary she possessed. She told herself to leave, to go now, not tomorrow, not after breakfast. She would take everything she had and fling it out of the house, and never look back. Her feet would not obey. They were locked by the conflict between the woman who had slept in his arms, and the woman who now watched a part of him unlink from human anatomy. The thought of him waking with a normal face while something else remained tucked beneath the cushions felt like a betrayal that could not be borne. Then he moved. It was a small, natural twitch, an eye rearranging itself in sleep, a shoulder knitting into a new posture. The motion unlatched whatever conservancy had held the creature's form at bay. The tail, that was what it had become in her mouth before she could stop it, slid out in a motion that looked like patience had become action. It extended with a deliberate, unhurried confidence, a length of muscle and sheen that threaded between cushions and onto the floor, curling at the end into a rounded tip that pulsed against the hardwood as if tasting the air. She saw it all in a single sick shot. The curve, the bands, the tiny rhythmic flexing. It was a python's elegance translated into the wrong body. The skin was not merely scaled. It shone with a dampness that made the lamplight swim. It moved soundlessly, and with each inch it uncoiled, the room contracted around her. Her scream made a sound finally, but it was small, a broken reed of a thing. It did not reach the bedroom, did not wake neighbors. Doha woke instead, as if the sound were a soft punctuation in a dream. He opened his eyes, and for a moment there was confusion, a human split second where recognition burrowed into his features. Then his face smoothed into an expression that was almost crookedly apologetic. "What's wrong?" he asked, voice ordinary and low and human. Julia's mind offered the obvious. "You're not what you are." The sentence came out like a shard. It meant nothing and everything at once. He turned toward her, his hand reaching for her face with the same gentleness that had once folded her hair back from her brow. She saw again the seam along his hip where flesh became something else. But when his hand touched her, it was warm and flesh, and the smell of cedar rose in the small space between them. The tail, in that instant, withdrew as if ashamed, as if privacy were a courtesy it had chosen to observe. "Come on," he said with the faintest smile. "You're scaring yourself." She staggered up and knocked a lamp with her elbow. The light rocked and steadied. When she turned her head, the space where the tail had been offered only a shadow and a cushion, and then the cushion, too, slid back into place as if the room itself were erasing the evidence. He stood up, smooth as always. He folded himself into the man she had slept with weeks ago, eyebrows concerned, mouth open in a humane plea. "You're shaking," he said softly. "Maybe you should rest. You can sleep here." There was shock inside her like frost. He was a man offering comfort. He had the face of a man. The tail had been an aberration, a trick of light, a bruised memory thrown into shape by an overtaxed mind. She wanted to believe this with every bone. The part of her that had curled like a child on his chest when they had watched rain felt the pull of sleep again, a dangerous sliver of peace. She sank back on the couch as if she had been invited to a dream. The house held its breath. She let the weight of exhaustion close her lids because some part of her was terrified of waking into a world where the revelation was real and absolutist and there would be no return. Her head found the hollow at his shoulder, and she surrendered to sleep as if to a promise. She slept in his arms that night. She slept with a thing coiled beneath the furniture and a man whose hands smelled of cedar, and whose eyes, when she opened them, were exactly as human as she had always wished. The trust returned like a tidal lie, comforting, warming, treacherous. When she woke, dawn sat like a pale eye behind the curtains. He was gone. There was the ordinary imprint of where he had slept. The couch sagged with the memory of him. But the house felt different, as if a window had been opened to let out a secret, and the air left hollow after. She moved through rooms with the slow, puzzling dread of someone piecing together a crime scene. The cushions would not spill the evidence. There was no trace on the hardwood where the tail had pulsed, no mark on the rug. It was as if the house had swallowed proof into its belly. She called Kem first, voice brittle and too loud in the ear. "He was here last night," she said. Something was wrong. Kem came over fast, barefoot and serious, carrying a thermos, as if she might pour logic into the place like a bracing drink. They paced the house like detectives who did not yet have jurisdiction. Julia told the whole thing. The cold, the scales, the way the tail had curled against the floor. Kem touched each surface with a sort of reverent frustration. "We need to call someone," she said. "Security, police, someone who can look, officially." They called. Security guards arrived, polite and trained to believe most things could be explained by human error. An unlocked window, a power surge, a visitor asleep on the couch. They put on plastic gloves and moved like professionals who received many calls at odd hours. They searched under couches, in cabinets, in the garden where moonlight pooled and made the shrubs look like sleeping things waiting to be mistaken for monsters. The guards found nothing. There were no tracks. Surveillance footage, where it existed for the small slice of the neighborhood, showed a house that had accepted evening and later morning with no sinister traffic. The police were kinder than she expected. Younger men with sympathetic eyes and older women with the patience of people who had learned to listen for a living. They took her statement, asked the right questions in the right tone. "Did you consume any substances? Have you been under stress?" They wrote things on forms and folded them into envelopes that would later sit on desks. In the end, the only tangible piece was the memory of her, vivid, nervous, and alone, and the picture of a man who had smiled too perfectly. Doha's apartment, when security checked it, was empty, as if it had been staged for a life that never happened. Books, neatly aligned, clothing folded in compartments, an identity made of careful smallness. There was no passport, no laptop, no phone active on any network that could be triangulated. He had acquaintances who spoke of him in guarded terms, a roommate in another city, an ex who had seemed baffled by his courtesy, a landlord who shrugged when asked if he belonged to anything. Nothing anchored him to the world. A week later the house felt like a stage set stripped of props. People visited out of a strange respect for the grotesque. They said, "I'm sorry," and "take your time," and "we believe you," words that do not stitch real wounds. Her mother came and placed cold cups of tea on the coffee table, eyes brimming with something like sorrow and something like the complacency of being right. "I told you," she said once, but it was a whisper, almost kind. In the privacy of late nights, when the house settled into its own bones, Julia tried to believe in the human things that had anchored her before. The scent of cedar, the weight of another body, the soft cadence of human sleep. Yet she woke at odd hours with the impression of a sliding movement at the periphery of vision. She found that mirrors became suspect surfaces. Windows more treacherous than glass had the right to be. Once, when she thought of calling Kem in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, a photograph on a shelf caught her eye. Doha smiling at a party, bright and composed. Behind him, a chair leg cast a shadow that, to the minute in which she was attuned to such things, looked like the faint curve of a coil. When she showed Kem the picture, Kem frowned and said, "It's probably just light." They both knew what that meant. Months passed. The house remained hers by legal title and by the terror of what sleeping there might mean. She stayed a nocturnal person now, mistrust seeping into routines. Friends came and went, leaving small fragrant evidence of human life. Coffee cups, borrowed jackets, the echo of laughter. With each visitor, the house tried to become ordinary and failed. Julia learned to keep lights on in rooms where shadows gathered, to stack the cushions in a way that left no crevice for a secret to hide. It did not help. The knowledge that she had slept in the arms of danger held down the air like humidity. It refused to let the house dry. She tried to make sense of what she had seen without turning the world into a lecture. She read things that were not meant to be read, stories that touched on shape and disguise, on animals that took other skins. She refused, fiercely and with a conviction that felt half-hallowed, to go the route of explanation. The creature did not need a taxonomy. It needed to be acknowledged as a threat that had the elegance of stone and the patience of river water. To name it would be to make it smaller. She would not do it that kindness. People tire of monsters. They prefer to fold them away into old tales. That is how things survive. We either put monsters in museums or we let our fear make them ordinary. Julia found neither option pleasing. She wanted the monstrous named for what it was, but she could not force the world to agree with one woman's awful clarity. There were times, cruel and exacting, when her memory betrayed her. She would be making coffee, steam fogging the window, and see the trail of her hands and think, for a long minute, that the pattern on the counter was a scale. A radio would announce the weather, and her ears would try to file it into a ledger of alarms. Once, when she arrived at work, a colleague's scarf hung oddly, and, in the way nervous people misperceive, it looked like a tail slung across a chair. She laughed then, the sound brittle and too loud, and people smiled and moved on. Doha's absence became a presence of its own. He was the negative space in photographs, the missing chord at the end of music. People from his past phoned at odd hours with clipped stories, a name that did not match an address, a memory of him in another city at another time. She tried to stitch these loose ends into a coat of proof, but the threads would not hold. The more she pressed, the more the world narrowed into a tiny, bright focus on the moment where a tail had rolled across the hardwood and curled itself into the shadows. She could have left the house. Friends and family offered couches and spare rooms like lifelines, but leaving felt like admitting defeat to the shape of the world. Staying was an act of stubbornness that also felt like penance. She learned the geography of wakefulness, which chairs made her feel safer, the way a closet door clicked when it sealed, the path from the front door to the car that minimized blind spots. She planned small routes like an urban cartographer of caution. The police files grew thin. People stop looking at things they cannot explain. They are tired of investing belief where belief yields nothing but a woman's shivering testimony. She often imagined a scene in which everything was undeniable. A live broadcast, a camera that could not be denied, a flaring headline. She imagined confronting him in the light of 100 witnesses and watching the tale uncoil like a contract signed in blood. But such fantasies are the refuge of the wounded who crave the comfort of consensus. The night of the second incident, she had a plan less about entrapment and more about truth. She would not drug him. She would not make herself a perpetrator of something illegal. She would facilitate a natural slumber and then maintain a vigil. She would keep her phone off the house network and sit in a chair with a lamp. She told Kem where she would be. If anything happened, someone would have a name to call. He arrived late, soft-footed as always, and settled beside her as if the living room had been designed for 2 bodies and indefinite confession. He told her a story about a river that would never be crossed, a parable he lifted from nowhere and gave to her like a gift. His hand found hers. The house pressed close. She kept watching until the pulse at his wrist evened and the eyelids slackened. Once again, the room altered as sleep spread over him like a blanket. She blinked. She blinked again. At the edge of her vision, something emerged from the space where the cushion met the frame. It was not the sudden flourish of something terrifying. It was a slow, thoughtful unveiling, like a curtain pulled aside to reveal a thing already there. The tail threaded itself from under the couch, bands of color spiraling like a rope, the tip tasting the air as if it were discovering a new flavor. It moved in a motion that was neither hurried nor hiding. It coiled nearer to her chair. She wanted to stand and run. She wanted to wake him and demand an explanation difficult enough to rupture normality. Instead, she sat and watched, because that is what a person does when they wish to gather evidence. They become an instrument of the world, patient, precise, consuming each small movement to form a picture. The tail brushed the hem of her shoe, and she felt an electric reaction that had nothing to do with current. She heard, behind her ribs, a sound she had never heard from herself before, a long, wordless suffocation of air. The tail withdrew, as if sensing the alarm, and for a breath she was sure she had mistaken a coat for a creature. Then it uncoiled again, more of it. There was a vastness to the way it extended, a length that implied hiding places beyond the room and beneath the foundations of the house. It had the patience of rivers. It had the geometry of plans. It revealed itself more fully along the hardwood. Bands mapped its skin like some forgotten language, an arrangement of light and dark that her brain rejected as belonging to a human. It was more than a limb. It was a design principle that had been integrated into the wrong architecture. It moved with a weight that defied the expected sounds of motion. No hiss, no scrape. Just a quiet, steady presence like a tide. It tasted the air, and Julia felt tasted in return, observed in a way that turned her small and luminous, and therefore prey. She stood up. The lamp tipped. Its light washed the floor in a wild ellipse. When the light steadied, the tail had drawn itself partly back, hiding the most incriminating lengths under shadows. Doha's face, waking in the high moment of being noticed, fixed on her with a slant of expression that had no mercy, but had finesse. He reached, gentle, human, and his fingers brushed her wrist with that seismic kindness that had once lulled her into trust. "Don't do this," he said, and the phrase was a soft weapon, wielded with the authority of someone who understood how to make people shrink. "Come back here. Stop letting your imagination run away." She wanted to tell him everything. She wanted to open her mouth and vomit the truth in a single bright fountain. Instead, she stepped back. She opened the door and ran out because there was something in the visceral act of leaving that felt less compromising than the attempt to fix the unspeakable with logic. Her shoes slapped the steps. The night air was sharp enough to cut through the fog of fear. She ran to Kem's apartment, and at last, when her body could no longer hold the rawness, she told the story again. They called the police a second time. The house was searched more carefully, with gloves and official forms and a polite but increasingly skeptical determination. Officers checked under every rug, behind every baseboard. They found nothing. The tail and the marks it must have left had retreated like a dream. Security reviewed camera footage and found blank spaces where movement should have been. When Kem asked a guard if the recordings had been altered, the guard shrugged. "That's not our call," he said, and in the unsaid of that sentence were other sentences. "We see strange things, but we don't change facts for people. We preserve evidence that holds." Julia felt, in that week, the cold of a person betrayed by perception. People who once believed her faltered. "Memory is tricky," a counselor told her in a low, gently clinical voice. "Stress can play tricks." She wanted to throw something at the counselor's head, because the counselor's words were not malicious, but they were a net that would contain her story and make it smaller, easier to file away under psychological phenomena. Doha was gone. The house kept the space of his absence like a cultural artifact, a relic of something important that had slid away. She contacted the people whose names he had given in the first weeks, a cousin, an old friend, a roommate, and found them oddly inconsistent or unreachable. It was as if the man who had offered a house had also offered a network of lies that rearranged itself whenever pressure came. Each failed attempt to trace him narrowed the world into a tighter lattice of fear and uncertainty. Months later, she found an item she could not explain. It was a button that had belonged to one of Doha's jackets, found in a pocket of a garment she had not seen since the night of the first revelation. The button was ordinary, black, matte, stitched to a shard of fabric. But when she turned it over, under a lamp that made the world too bright, she saw a pattern, a faint, almost imperceptible ridging that, in a certain slant of light, resembled the pattern on the scales she had seen. It could have been anything, a manufacturing lull, an echo of a design. She kept the button in the bottom drawer of a dresser, and sometimes, in mornings when the house felt like a vast, blank stage, she would slide her fingers over it and feel the memory like a pulse. There were nights when she dreamed of coils. In the dreams, she could hear the hush of scales unrolling, and she would wake with her voice raw from speaking. Neighbors began to see her as someone who had endured something unspeakable and maybe unprovable. Some gave her space. Some avoided her eyes at social gatherings. Somewhere in the country, a man with a face that passed as ordinary moved between towns like a shadow that was practiced at not being noticed. The lesson she learned, the only thing that kept shape as the rest dissolved, was that appearances are not just deceiving. They are sometimes weapons. A smile can be a mask worn by patient hunger. A present can be an instrument of control. To love, she discovered, requires both softness and a cautious kind of vision. When she told that to Kem, sitting at a diner with coffee cooling between them, Kem held her hand and said nothing. Saying nothing was a language that had grown between them. A pact that was not about the truth, but about holding one another through it. she did not find him again. There were rumors. A man in a different state seen with the same composure and the same impossible smile. A photograph that made her stomach flip and then seemed to be only light and shadow. Each rumor was both balm and coal. They place a person on a map and erase him again. That kind of absence is worse than clarity because it suggests continuation, not closure. In time, the fear tempered into a new form of alertness that became part of her body. She learned to read the small inconsistencies. A laugh that lagged, a phrase that did not quite fit with the mouth that spoke it. The way someone reads weather in the sky. She kept her nights watched and her doors locked and never again slept with the unguarded trust that had led her into a peril she could not have predicted. Sometimes, when the house fell into its late-night hush, she would walk the rooms without the pressure of panic, just to feel the angles of her life reshape. She would stand in front of the mirror and look for anomalies, for the echo of past edges. Once, when the light fell just so, she thought she saw a curve in the reflection of the staircase that echoed the shape of the tale she had watched. For a minute she imagined the creature slithering under the house like a second foundation. Then she laughed softly at herself and turned a light on. The final thing that happened was small and accurate in its cruelty. A neighbor, kind and distractingly ordinary, invited her to a quiet barbecue in late summer. The street hummed with families and gardens. Children ran with the furtive joy of minor rebellion. Doors were open like promises. She went because staying inside felt like feeding fear. She wore a dress that had once made her feel human in a way clothes rarely do anymore. From a distance, near the grill, he stood. He looked at her with that slow, expert recognition people use when they remember faces and want to decide whether to claim them as friends. He was not the man who had given her a house. He had no claim on the world she had lost. But in the moment their eyes met, something old and terrible and intimate passed between them, like a weather front sweeping through a landscape. He smiled with the practiced curve that had unmoored her life. For a second it was hard to breathe. Every memory and every fear and every version of the truth she had lived with pressed into that smile. He had not been recognized by other people around them. No one murmured. No one dragged him away. He stood as an ordinary person in a grill-lit neighborhood, and with an economy of motion that might have been tender or might have been predatory. He lifted a hand in greeting. She raised her own hand and then lowered it. She was not the woman who would run toward him or into his arms. She had been taught, by the strongest of lessons, not to give trust without a ledger. She nodded once, small, then walked away. He watched her go, expression untroubled, as though he had not just been seen in the only place now sacred to him. He turned back toward the grill, as if the world had not been rearranged. That is the final frame that kept the truth raw. He could stand in the middle of ordinary light and charm and not be exposed for what she had seen. He remained, in the world, a man without explanation. She remained, in her head and body, the woman who had made a choice to survive within that uncertainty. There is a cruelty to loose ends and a mercy to them. The creature, whatever it truly was, did not need a reason to exist. It needed only to be. Her life after it was a map of adjustments, a perpetual scanning of reflections and smiles and doorways. She learned, fiercely and tenderly, to trust herself. When someone new came into her life later, she let small things have their shadows before she offered warmth. She did not recommend paranoia. She recommended attention. If you've been touched by this, if you've ever found yourself in the soft territory between love and alarm, share your thought below, and don't be afraid to reach out to someone who will listen. She had slept in the arms of danger once, with the comfort of another's weight insistent enough to hush caution. The lesson she carried was honest and brutal. Beauty can be a skin for hunger. Trust can be the bridge to a place you cannot get back from. The house, the present, the smile, they all taught her to look for the seams. In the end, the danger did not get a name. It kept one foot in the world everyone agreed on, and another in a shadow none of them could explain. That ambiguity is its power. It vanished as quietly as it had arrived, leaving behind the imprint of a lesson stitched into muscle and habit. She learned vigilance without becoming a hermit. She learned to sleep with lights on, not to let fear be the only thing that taught her. And sometimes, late at night, When the house settles, and the city breathes down the street, she watches the mirror and allows herself one private prayer. Not for answers, for those had never been promised, but for the courage to trust her own eyes if the world ever tries to make her doubt them again. If this unsettled you, if you want another story like this one, subscribe and watch the next tale. And be careful who you let hold you.